Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's CECAN seminar. I'm Nigel Gilbert. I'm a professor at the University of Surrey and the director of CECAN. For those of you who haven't joined us before, CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus, which is why everybody calls it CECAN. And it's been transforming the practice of policy evaluation across the food, energy, water, and environmental domains to make it fit for a complex world. We've achieved this through pioneering, testing, and promoting innovative policy evaluation approaches with the UK government departments. To find out more about us, please do visit our website, cecan.ac.uk. Today's webinar is about policy red teaming. We're delighted to have Linda Lammensalo presenting the webinar today. In her current role at the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, Linda is responsible for stakeholder engagement initiatives and developing an interactive science policy concept called Science Sparring, which is what she's going to be talking about. It's a model for policy red teaming designed to address systemic policy issues. Please submit your questions at any point via the question box, which you should be able to see on the Zoom webinar control panel labeled Q&A. You'll also be able to upvote other people's questions. The session will be recorded and we'll later make it available on the CECAN website, along with the slides. So I'll now hand over to Linda for the presentation. Linda, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Nigel and CECAN for this opportunity to present our work at the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. So I have been a CECAN fellow last year, which was a wonderful experience. And I'm going to be talking about a knowledge brokering concept that I also addressed in my CECAN fellowship, which is called Science Sparring, essentially a policy red teaming model. So today I'm going to structure my presentation around these 5 steps. So I'll start with introducing my role and our organization. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we have been developing policy red teaming, what it actually is, some concrete case examples, and then some challenges and next steps. But let me start with my organization, Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, where I work as a knowledge broker with the aim to really develop models and methods to bring research evidence into policymaking processes. So the Academy is an independent boundary organization. We work with over 800 members who are like highly esteemed members of the scientific community. And our mission is really to enhance how scientific evidence is used in the society. And ever since 2019, we've been really looking at how we can advance evidence-informed policymaking. And we have been doing this primarily through 3 different strategies. So the first one has been really to focus on capacity building. The second one on developing new models to support effective knowledge brokering, which is my presentation today. And then we've been building this community of knowledge brokering and enhancing this conversation about how to strengthen evidence-informed policymaking. We work primarily with national governments, so with ministries and in close collaboration, particularly with the Prime Minister's office. But let me start with this picture, which I'm sure many of you know. It's the risk report of the World Economic Forum, and it kind of outlines the risk landscape for the next 2 years and 10 years and ranks them by severity. And the reason why I want to start with this is because I think it shows how difficult landscape policymakers are navigating. They're navigating rapidly changing and entangled policy issues. And these are like rapidly changing as well. So it kind of showcases the policy topics or the kind of landscape where science advice and knowledge brokering models need to adapt to. And of course, there is the challenge that especially with the rise of AI, policymakers have more and more information available for them. But what we have recognized is that in these conditions where there is deep uncertainty related to the policy issues and how entangled they are, but also in this rise of evidence and rise of information, also mis and disinformation, policymakers actually, instead of needing solely evidence, they also need help on structuring what is known, what is contested, and what is genuinely unknown. So this is kind of where we've been trying to look at what knowledge brokering models could provide solution to this particular issue. And why we started this is that at the start of this development work in 2019, we had conversation with ministries where we looked at how they kind of get the evidence at the moment. And a lot of that science advice mechanisms and the evidence, how they got the evidence, essentially was through this what is called question and answer logic. So they formulate questions and then assume that they are the right questions and they won't change in terms of time. And then hope that researchers can answer those. And of course, I'm sure many of you know there's a lot of challenges to this in terms of mismatch of that knowledge and how even difficult it is to articulate the right questions. So we started to look at if there are alternative or different ways of bringing science advice or research evidence into policy making processes. And secondly, we kind of noticed that this model, the question and answer logic, does not necessarily also challenge what is being presented in the policy formulation. So, of course, draft policy strategies, impact assessments, they also make assumptions about things. So we thought that if these assumptions remain unchallenged, they can create these vulnerabilities, which are kind of these points where the reasoning might fail in terms of these uncertain future developments. So bringing these kind of two challenges, we started to think about whether there are alternative ways of framing it and kind of bringing a new way of knowledge brokering that could add to the existing models. So rather than supplying the policymakers with more evidence and sort of definite interpretations, could we produce models that would help them to challenge the policy reasoning, see what weaknesses there might be, what unintended consequences they might carry, and how they could be tested? So we looked at whether there are alternative or if this has been done, and of course there's many cases where similar work has been carried in terms of devil's advocacy, which is essentially bringing adversarial thinking to policy drafting. Then there's been policy stress testing, which kind of has this similar mindset to it, but using it in terms of bringing scenarios, so kind of these future thinking scenarios and testing those policy plans and their kind of thinking against these divergent scenarios. But then there's been also red teaming, which has been particularly used in the intelligence, in the risk management and foresight community. So we got really inspired, particularly by that, and started to develop a concept called Science Sparring, which essentially is adopting this red teaming mindset to policy or science policy contexts. So in red teaming, there is the idea that a group that is independent from drafting a policy or drafting a strategy comes and brings this kind of outsider expertise and challenges that initial draft or policy. So in our model, we started to bring researchers, multidisciplinary group of researchers, to act as this kind of red team, adopting a critical mindset, and red team the subject, which in our case has been quite often the early policy draft. And the goal of this policy red teaming then has become to identify those unintended consequences, assumptions, evidence gaps that are in the early policy draft. So that has been kind of the framing of it. And through this iterative piloting and testing, we've now done around 20 cases, a bit over, but we have started to identify that this can bring this kind of epistemic stress testing of policy draft. So we really use early policy draft as boundary objects to see where their vulnerabilities lie and how they could be then adopted or changed in that live situation. So it can kind of help to map those uncertainties, those potential risks, and hopefully bring more or improve the robustness of these policies, which in this case is defined as the capacity of the policy reasoning to withstand scrutiny and remain its core functions across time. So before I go into the practice and give you some concrete examples, I want to show one more slide on the kind of methodology that we have been using and that has inspired our work. So probably many of you know this known knowns and unknowns framework. So we have used it as a way to kind of make these science policy discussions more purpose-driven and kind of orient the science sparring process. So in my experience working previously as a knowledge broker at the university, I witnessed that there is these science policy discussions where there's a nice atmosphere, but then people kind of speak about the things that everybody in the room already knows. So a lot of like this kind of critical scrutiny often doesn't happen. So we started to look at how could we make these science sparring processes more purpose driven and avoid spending all of the time in the science policy dialogue space in the known knowns. So we've started to, at the start of the science sparring process, to really identify what is already known, what kind of evidence and added value can the process bring, and what don't we need to discuss in terms of in these science sparring processes. So identify the known knowns really as quickly as possible. And then moving on towards making sense of the issue, what things we are aware but don't fully understand. And this is particularly where the multidisciplinary aspects of bringing researchers from different perspectives brings added value. So usually in the science sparring process nowadays, we have around 5 to 7 researchers. So still quite limited, but still bringing that kind of looking at the policy topic from different angles. And then towards the end of the process, we start to work on the unknown knowns, so things we are not aware, but they kind of understand that they might be linked to it. So this is often been the case that we look at the assumptions in the policy draft and challenge them based on the best available evidence. Or alternatively, we look at where there might be evidence gaps, things we don't know, and how could that uncertainty related to it make the policy draft vulnerable. And this is a little bit linked to the last stage of the unknown unknowns, where, of course, this is a really ambitious goal to get to, but we've started to kind of look at how could the policy draft be vulnerable to future changes? So can we envision some weak signals of things that might change that should be taken into consideration in the current policy drafting? So that's been kind of the methodology of organizing the discussions around the workshops. And on the practical side, here is how we've kind of framed the science sparring process into 4 steps. Sometimes we say it's 5 steps, where the fifth one would be the final synthesis. But here I've outlined it into 4 steps. Where the first one is really the knowledge need occurring. Currently, we're in a lucky situation where actually the ministries usually contact us with a policy problem or policy process where they want to use science sparring. Of course, it's not always been that way, and we have had to do quite a lot of work to get to that stage. But usually, these are now so-called demand-driven. And once we have that kind of policy case, then we spend quite a lot of time in identifying the knowledge need. So this is what I mentioned on the known example. So we try to identify us as knowledge brokers, kind of interviewing the policymakers and trying to understand what knowledge do they already have, what is the added value of the process, what disciplines or academic disciplines they would want to be included in the process. Are there certain academic disciplines that they haven't heard previously? Could they bring an added layer of adversarial scrutiny into the process, and so on and so forth? This is also the stage where we usually start having these discussions about what is the preparatory material for the discussion. So is there an early policy draft that can be used and shared with all the participants? And usually this is the ideal case, that there would be something like this, because then that helps to organize the discussion as well. Then the third step is identifying researchers. This is really the work of us knowledge brokers and identifying the best possible people to participate. Usually we take into consideration also the seniority and geographic considerations, gender balance, and so forth, and really try to make a group also diverse in those aspects as well, because it really brings this added layer of multi or like challenge from different perspectives. And then the science sparring process kind of culminates in these workshops where we have people from, in our case, ministry, like civil servants from the ministries participating and bringing their expertise also to the discussion, and kind of this discussion of what are the realms of policymaking. So that's been something that we have found as actually really valuable, that they explain in the situation of what can be changed and what cannot be changed in the policy draft, and bringing expertise on that front to the discussion, and then the researchers kind of challenging the early policy draft. And us knowledge brokers facilitate the discussions, help to uncover those difficult subjects in the topic, and make the room feel really trusted for everyone to participate and bring their expertise. And once the workshop is done, we also synthesize the findings and validate that synthesis with the researchers, because often, at least in our case in the academy, we're not subject matter experts on the policy topics that we address. So it's really important that the researchers validate the synthesis, because then that gets used in the ministries and hopefully later in the policymaking processes as well. Usually, this whole process, these 4 steps, takes between 2 to 4 months. There have been cases where it's taken 12 months, but usually this has been the case that the policymakers, they have wanted to push back and have it at a later stage or something like that. So ideally, it usually takes 2 to 4 months to facilitate the whole process. So I wanted to give you a few practical examples. As I mentioned, we have done over 20 science sparrings. We have used it in different policy topics and policy problems. And so far, we have done it in 10 out of 12 Finnish ministries. So have been able to try it on in kind of different contexts. It's also being piloted in Finland and city level, but not by us. So it shows some promise in that front as well. But our work has been primarily with the national ministries. And I think it has shown some positive results. So we can really see that this challenging the policy formulation, challenging kind of adversarial scrutiny is something new, and it's something that has been really helpful for the policymakers themselves, because it has helped them to see the weaknesses and potential flaws in their early draft. But to give you a little bit concrete, practical examples of how this looks like or how it has looked like, I have two examples, and the first one is one that we did a couple of years ago with the Prime Minister's office on the state R&D funding monitoring and evaluation plan. So this was actually a process where we had two workshops, like kind of building onto each other. So it really helped us to see how the inputs from the first workshops were developed by the policymakers, and then the researchers then again brought this adversarial scrutiny and fine-tuned the draft even further. So in this case, we actually had the early draft of the monitoring and evaluation plan that we had. I think in this case, it was 6 researchers that were bringing their adversarial scrutiny to this document. And the goal was really to supplement the evaluation framework, see if it's evidence-based, if there's something that should be fine-tuned in that, but then also look at particularly the monitoring indicators. Do we have data to support those indicators? Do they need to be changed? So on and so forth. And I think the really interesting observation from this was that not only that this kind of two workshop model works if there is time for that, but then also that it really helped to develop this impact framework as a comprehensive whole. So actually, a couple months ago, the Secretary General of who was responsible of developing this monitoring and evaluation plan said that the science sparring really helped to develop this plan in a comprehensive way and enhance its quality from evidence-based perspective. And as a result of the discussions, more concretely, some indicators, their weighing was revised and some even dropped completely. I remember particularly sustainability was added also to those. But then another, a little bit different example is one we did with the National Emergency Supply Agency and an NGO called Operation Arctics. It was on amok and its potential collapse. And in this case, the preparatory document was this synthesis of anticipated impacts of amok's potential collapse. And this was actually produced by the NGO Operation Arctis. So it was a nice kind of collaboration of bringing another stakeholder into the process. And their role was really clear in that. And the objective here was to really identify the direct and cascading impacts of amok's tipping point on Finland, and particularly their implications to the security of supply. And what we really learned from this is that, well, first of all, unlike many of our other science sparrings, we did this in a more supply-driven manner. So instead of the National Emergency Supply Agency coming to us and asking for us to science spar with them, we actually contacted them and wanted to kind of explore whether they're interested in trying something like this. So in their processes, they hadn't really thought about how Earth system tipping points can be addressed in their strategy. So this was more on the agenda setting stage of their processes. So it took us a little bit more time into understanding what type of knowledge is relevant for them, what kind of expertise would be most valuable for them. So while this did work really well, it showed that this supply-driven science sparring model takes a little bit more time in terms of defining the knowledge need. Then perhaps something that I learned is that our framing was very much on kind of creating these or defining what could be the potential impacts. And because this is a topic with high uncertainty, I think if I would do it again, I would actually change the mindset a little bit and focus on system vulnerability. So look at where does Finland's preparedness currently actually assume climate stability and identify then risks and weaknesses in relating to those. So still a little bit similar, but I think this was a nice example of how even the science sparring model needs to adapt when we have these really, really high uncertainty policy topics to be addressed. Nevertheless, the observation or kind of the impact of this science sparring was really interesting. So the participants from the National Emergency Supply Agency actually recognized that, or towards the end of the workshop, they said that this actually changed our thinking in how we reframe preparedness. So addressing Earth system tipping points challenges our way of framing preparedness. So, because these tipping points would bring potentially a permanent shift, it would require them to have the courage to act and address preparedness before things become urgent or before the need becomes urgent for them. So, kind of different to how they usually do things. So, this piloting and doing this on the ground has kind of showed us that there are several typical policy questions or framings that the science sparring model works particularly well. First is when there is kind of need to understand what could be the potential risk or unintended consequences, whether it relates to like concrete implementation plans or a strategy or whatever. The second one is usually if the evidence base at the start of the policy formulation needs critical scrutiny. So that has been a really good example as well. And then the third one is when there has been this kind of need to have an early assessment of the potential impacts. So kind of this early proactive impact assessment type of case. And from this development work, we have, of course, seen that the model needs to adapt continuously, and we do little tweaks here and there all the time when the policy problems or policy framings changed. But what we have recognized that we're kind of keeping always are these elements. So the focus on policy relevance has been really crucial. So we clearly spend quite a lot of time on the process on defining this knowledge need and anchoring the discussions on that knowledge need. Here in Finland, we have high levels of trust, so we don't usually have problems of sharing early policy drafts. Of course, we do that in a trusted and disclosed manner, but it's also a way to help prioritize this policy relevance, that we have these early policy drafts as boundary objects. And actually also it helps to in this dialogue setting, it helps to avoid people talking about different things when we have always the anchor, the policy draft that we can, as knowledge brokers, facilitators, kind of anchor the discussion. So then there isn't so much of this mismatch on what or misunderstandings of what people are talking about. And it also, the final synthesis kind of supports this, that it can be used afterwards, and hopefully the discussion points can be like used later on in the policy preparation processes. We've also learned that this adversarial scrutiny, stress testing can provide a really added value to the policy preparation processes. It's very different to the government consultation processes, and it can be like a complementary way of having early engagement of researchers into the policy preparation. I've already mentioned working with a boundary document. It really helps to make the discussions productive and reduce this kind of unproductive tangents where the discussion often can go if there is not clear facilitation. Emphasis on multidisciplinarity. Often the policymakers, civil servants from the ministries, they really highlight that it was fantastic that I got to learn new researchers. I got to hear from different perspectives. So this is really has been the value added of this process. Then, of course, our role as knowledge brokers is to really make this process as easy as possible for both the policymakers, but then also the researchers. We're both incredibly busy, so we aim to make the process as easy for everyone to participate, but also build this trust between the researchers and policymakers themselves. The workshops in Science Sparring are always closed door dialogues. We use Chatham House rules. So I think this also brings this kind of adversarial critique and explorative space, or it kind of facilitates that. It's really integral for that part. I know the font is teeny tiny in here, but I just wanted to, I think the slides will be shared afterwards as well. So if you're interested, you can see the cases here and also show kind of the variety of policy topics that we've been working with. But I want to end with some challenges and next steps. So in terms of existing challenges, I think I mentioned that we have been piloting with 10 ministries. We would want to have done it with all 12. So I think we're still struggling a little bit with how to establish legitimacy across different contexts and how it can be applied in different policy topics. Also, we are interested to see whether it could be used in the political decision-making space. That's something that we haven't done yet. So that's one area to be explored. Then it can be quite resource intensive and time consuming, particularly for the knowledge brokers. So this kind of links to a little bit of the scaling the model. So how it can be scaled and made its use wider is still something that we're trying to navigate a little bit. But I have one slide on this because we have been trying to train other knowledge brokers to use the model. So that's something that we are already trying to tap into and address. But then the third challenge is, of course, how the model can be integrated more systematically into early policy processes. So it's linked to the first challenge. Something that we're currently doing is exploring, like everyone else, on the use of AI and how it could really augment this adversarial scrutiny and this red teaming. So we're actually partnering with the University of Aalto, which is a really tech-savvy university here in Finland, and with their HCI experts to see how AI could augment this adversarial scrutiny and this red teaming. We have, for example, been piloting with these archetypes, system thinker, for example, risk averse. How could they be used as a way to challenge the participants' thinking in the workshop setting? And then this spring, we have actually built a prototype to support facilitators to particularly challenge the participants in the assumption stress testing. So interesting developments there. But then, of course, we have been trying to scale the model and its use to others. In the academy, we're a team of 9 people, and currently 2 of us are working on the Science Sparring concept. So it will not change the world if we don't have more people doing it. So that's why we've been building a community of policy red teamers here in Finland nationally. We had organized this spring a Science Sparring masterclass, kind of inspired by CECAN fellowship, where we trained 24 knowledge brokers from different organizations to use the model. And this masterclass actually finished 2 weeks ago, and we have already 4 ongoing pilot projects with participants where they're in their own context trying the model, for example, in the municipal level here in Finland. We also have handbook. I wish we would have the English version ready to be shared with you, but unfortunately we only have the Finnish version now, and the English version will be published in early autumn. I think that's me with the presentation, but I'm happy to answer all the questions. And if there is not time for everyone's questions here, feel free to drop me an email and we can discuss bilaterally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. I think I can speak for us all. It was a really fascinating presentation, and there's lots of questions in the Q&A. Can I suggest, by the way, to those of you who are listening, that you either add your own questions to the list or upvote the ones that are already there. I will aim to ask Linda the questions that are receiving the most interest and the most votes. But I'm going to actually start with one that doesn't have an upvote, but I think is a fascinating question from Jacob, who asks, at a practical level, how do you ensure buy-in into the process? And do you get any pushback from the participants? And if so, any advice on how to manage it? I mean, if I were a policy person and somebody said that I should invite a whole bunch of people to pull my nice new policy apart, I'm unlikely to be very enthusiastic, surely.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think at the start, when we did initial pilots, we were fortunate to have partners or people from the ministries that we knew that are quite development oriented. So it was easier for us to pilot with them, and then the word of mouth kind of happened. So it helped us to also showcase what is the value added of these processes. But it does continue to remain a challenge, and particularly now when we're trying to reach and scale the model and its use, we have to kind of do a convincing on that front, particularly to the policymakers. So to kind of demonstrate to them what the value added is and how kind of light the process can be. And what I mentioned about the role of knowledge brokers there, I think is a key. So the people, the policymakers that have participated in have actually said that they didn't realize uh, like how easy it was for them to participate. So they spend a little bit of time with us defining the knowledge need, and then they came to a ready table where they actually got helpful feedback from researchers. So having this model that is kind of ready to use and someone facilitates it for you, I think is a good good way of demonstrating or getting that buy-in. From researchers' side, we don't usually have that problem because it's in our case, oftentimes the researchers are really, really keen to participate in policymaking processes, but for various reasons, they find it difficult to find those processes, or they feel like their institution doesn't necessarily support it or make it easy for them to participate. So for them as well, to have a concept where somebody facilitates that for them and they can come and directly speak with policymakers who actually spend 3 hours listening to them is really rewarding. But yeah, like I mentioned, I think it also helps to get the word of mouth and have a few pilots and then get people excited.
Helen Featherstone wants to ask a follow-up question is, are researchers paid for their time in taking part in this process?
Yeah, it's also a good question that we have been continuously thinking whether we need to change our approach to this. But currently, researchers are not paid for their time because the argument has been that it's their job is also to address the societal impact. So their employer should they also should spend certain amount of their time on these activities, and they could allocate it to participating in the science sparring. Of course, then we take care of all the other costs of their participation, but we don't compensate for the participating in the workshop.
Okay, thank you. Steve Lee asks, you talked about adversarial challenge in the workshops. How do you balance that with keeping the discussion flowing and helping policymakers hear the feedback? In
Yeah,
fact,
that's a
and
great.
just to follow up that, in fact, Helen again says she'd like to know more about how the workshops are facilitated and structured. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's flowing. And so I think the part of that answer to that question is actually spending spending that time with the policymakers before the workshop. So actually, a lot of the work that we do to make that workshop as productive as possible happens before that. So we do have bilateral calls with researchers where we kind of go over the policy context, we explain what kind of input is needed from them, what expertise is kind of expected of them, and how we structure the workshop. So they come knowing what to expect and what would be advantageous for the conversation. Similarly with policymakers, so that they actually kind of have that productive feeling in the workshop. We ask them in prior to coming to the workshop to first explain what the policy context is to the researchers, but then also bring their expertise to the discussion. So sometimes actually in the monitoring and evaluation example that I showed, I remember the policymaker said really frankly to one researcher's critique, like, yeah, it's a great critique, but what you're critiquing is like decided by political decision makers. We cannot absolutely change it. So, what is your best answer in this situation? So that really helps to kind of make that contribution beneficial for everyone, so that the policymakers also bring their kind of expertise to the discussion. And then it was Helen's question about how we structure it. So of course, this little bit depends on the knowledge need and the objectives for the whole process. But we quite often use actually this known knowns, unknown unknowns framework. So we start with a brief discussion about what is the shared understanding in the policy draft, what are the biggest flaws that we can envision, and then kind of quickly stopping there and moving on to the more nitty-gritty scrutiny. So we start by looking at what are the assumptions, challenging those evidence gaps. So we structure it around those kind of different elements in the circle that I showed. And then we usually end up with this kind of more future oriented looking at what potential weak signals there are and how they recognition of those signals should be adopted to the current policy preparation. But this is something that we also like change necessary, like if needed, depending on the policy context. So we also always listen what the ministries need and how that workshop structure needs to be tailored. But something like that usually is how it
Hmm,
happens.
great. So, how does policy red teaming compare to the theory of change development for policy? Both look to investigate similar things.
Yeah, I think it's there's a lot of parallels to that, and actually when we have been piloting with AI, for example, we have been looking at whether that's something that we could use as a kind of a prompt of how we could uncover the theory of change. With AI assisted methodology and then bring that as a tool to challenge the participants' thinking. So there are a lot of parallels and it's particularly, I think, to challenging those assumptions. So I think it's really complementary work, and we've been like looking at that as well. And I particularly talked about that in my CECAN fellowship with my mentor. So it's been really, I think, learning from both has been really developing this model as well.
Right. Yeah. So Tim Sutherland asks, does your process include economic, social science, and or behavioral expertise?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but so in the researchers themselves that are participant in the workshop, they come from very different disciplines. So there might be like economics, there might be sociologists. It always depends a little bit on the context as well, and we want to actually bring participants who have the policymakers have not thought about, so people they don't know, disciplines that they have never heard about or are not included in the drafting. So that, yeah, for sure. In terms of the developing the model, we have had collaborations with behavioral scientists in how we, us as knowledge brokers, have facilitate the science sparring process. So that has been also really helpful and also showed the relevance of having this anchor document. So yeah, we have heard their input loud and clear in the developing the model.
Good, yes. Well, that's good to hear. So Tom Dolan asks, would it work, this science sparring, across all areas of government policy, or are there particular fields of policy that are more or less receptive than others?
Yeah, good question. And it's been or also in our minds. So that's why we have wanted to work with different ministries and try its use in different contexts. I think we what we have learned is that it can be adopted to very different contexts. The most often the usefulness is in when the topic is really kind of systematic by its nature. It requires this multidisciplinary scrutiny, maybe cross-cutting from in terms of different ministries' expertise. So that's something that it has worked particularly well. One of the very first ones where we used the model was in this really early stage of impact assessment, and I think there it was a little bit we thought that okay, there is a matrix that keeps on going, and it's kind of difficult to have adversarial scrutiny on that on a 3 hour workshop. So we haven't repeated that context again, but I think it can be adopted to very different contexts. The challenge often is how to narrow it into a fruitful way, so that how can it be narrow it that it can be scrutinized within the space of 3 workshops. So that's why we spend a lot of time in the knowledge need definition to kind of understand what topics, even in the policy draft that the ministry is exploring, do we need to discuss all of them, or can we narrow it down to a specific issue in the policy draft? Because then that helps the quality. So yeah, I would say it's receptive to quite many.
Yeah, I can understand that. And in fact, in a slightly related question from Jeff Darch, is that he asks, were there any particular reasons that 2 of the 12 ministries didn't participate?
Yeah, I think they, at least one of them is because of the current government structure in Finland, and the minister in charge is less receptive to use of research evidence. So that has been the signal for us in terms of this one ministry. So we are, of course, having to deal with those political challenges. The other ministry that I can name is the defense ministry. So that's something they actually are using red teaming themselves, and we're interested in kind of complementing and working together. So that's the reason why we haven't been. We're like rather learning from each other than using the model in their use. But political priorities and how receptive they are to research is also affecting that.
Good. Well, we're keeping you busy here. What roles, what role do government scientists within ministries have in the process as opposed to external academics? And in fact, I follow up on that is we've talked about researchers
Mm.
in the red teaming. Are they all actually university academics, these researchers, or do they come from industry or elsewhere?
Yeah, in our case, they're from academic institutions, so either universities or then government research institutions. Yes, but then in terms of ministries, so in Finland, of course, a lot of the policy makers have academic background. So they have actually, when we started developing the model, they were the first ones who were interested in using and testing it. So they have been kind of receptive to thinking about new ways of bringing research evidence into the policy preparation processes. So they are not seeing as a competitive or something like that. Rather, I think they've been also interested in how this kind of added layer of science advice or new model of knowledge brokerage could support their work. And I think they've been really interested in this adversarial scrutiny in the sense that somebody comes from an outside perspective and challenges it without knowing kind of the background necessarily of how that policy came to be. So it's just actually kind of why we have built the model in the way we have. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Um, well, the next question from Ben Norris, I should say, is Can you speak how you developed this so that 10 of 12 ministries were coming to you to ask for this? We are beginning something similar, he says, and are looking to build this level of proactive engagement.
Yeah, oh,
Some tips.
that's really great to hear that you're doing something similar, and would be nice to hear more about it. I think for us, it's actually like when we have built a theory of change for the science sparring model, we have placed quite a lot of emphasis on finding the relevant people in each ministries who can serve as our contact points. So we have spent quite a lot of time in finding those people in these 10 ministries and having regular checkups with them and discussing what kind of upcoming policy processes they know that their ministry has, and could science borrowing be used in them. So it actually is finding, for us, it has been finding those allies in each ministry and kind of using their expertise and their knowledge on finding then the opportunities for us to pilot the model. So a lot of legwork and coffees.
Right. Okay, well, maybe Ben could get in touch with you directly and you could talk to him about that. Um, okay, I think we're running out of time now. I think we've probably only got time for one more question, and I'm going to. I think the one that we really haven't talked about at all is well, this one, which is how important is it for knowledge brokers to have expertise in specific areas of policy
Hmm.
compared to them being excellent facilitators that use science sparring to help draw out policy knowledge and insights from the civil servants themselves. So this is really a question of what are the important skills for a knowledge broker like yourself?
Yeah, that's a question that we've been exploring a lot in our masterclass this spring with the fellow knowledge brokers. And of course, having that subject matter expertise does help in facilitating the process and understanding what knowledge is kind of needed and added could be added value. But in terms of my role and my colleagues' role, I think for us, really understanding the policymaking processes and understanding the research community, and then kind of having the skills to bring people together and facilitate have been more important for us. So that's where my expertise definitely is. Of course, it's easier. My background is in global sustainability. So when there are topics related to that, of course, it's easier. But I think the facilitator skills and negotiating skills have been more emphasis on our side, which is good because those can be really developed through experience. And I do want to briefly jump in because there's been discussions about how it can be adopted in different contexts. We are interested in exploring it in different contexts, currently with the Nordics, but of course, we are happy to hear how you piloted something similar or continue that conversation. So, to Matt, who had questions about the materials, we are aiming to publish those in English as well, latest in autumn. But yeah, it would be great to hear if you have something similar ongoing in the UK.
Fantastic. That's a really good place to stop. So thank you ever so much. That's great. I think we've all learned a huge amount from this, and I think you'll be able to discover how much we've learned by the amount that we actually start doing it. Thank you ever so much. I suspect if Linda, you could put your last slide back up so that people have your contact details to get in touch with you immediately. But I should also remind you that the whole of this conversation all of this presentation will be available on the CECAN website in the next few days, as indeed will these slides. So if you want to refresh your memory on any of that, come back to the CECAN website. And remember that we have to be patient until August, but or the autumn, I should say. But in the autumn, hopefully, we'll be able to learn about all of this from your handbook, which I'm really looking forward to see. So thank you again, Linda, and thank you to all the audience, to participants. Bye.